guys, so today I want to recommend to you some easy to read non-fiction. So I like to read non-fiction. I talk about non-fiction on my channel. In fact, I have a whole playlist of non-fiction videos if you want to check those out. And something that people say a lot of the time to me is that they're finding it difficult to get into non-fiction, and they're a little bit daunted by it, and it's just not a part of their everyday reading. And I think from my own experience is that once non-fiction becomes part of your everyday reading, it gets a lot easier and it becomes as natural as reading fiction. But I totally appreciate that feeling when you haven't read much non-fiction, perhaps haven't read any non-fiction at all, and just not knowing where to start. And some non-fiction is incredibly dense, so if you start with the wrong thing, it can be very off-putting. So I thought I would collect together a few recommendations of different non-fiction books on a variety of topics that I think are easy reading. They're all books I enjoy as well. There are other non-fiction books I've read that I would consider easy reading but didn't necessarily love. These are all books that I both recommend as excellent pieces of literature and also as accessible non-fiction. So without further ado, let's get into the books. So my first two recommendations come with a bit of general advice as well, and that is to try non-fiction audiobooks. Now, of course, this is similar to reading non-fiction. If it's an incredibly dense book, it's not necessarily going to be accessible on audiobook any more than it is in physical book. However, there are a few non-fiction books out there, particularly ones that are read by the author that have an element of memoir to them, that I just think make for fantastic ends to non-fiction. They are very accessible. The author really brings them to life in those audiobooks, and two of those I want to recommend to you here. The first one is The Art of Asking by Amanda Palmer. Now, I actually read this book partially in physical copy and partially on the audiobook. I had both and I kind of flitted between them both, but I will say that Amanda Palmer does a fantastic job of narrating this audiobook, and this is one of these books that I would never have picked up if it was not for pressure from my friends and people I trusted. This book is all about Amanda Palmer's life, her journey to become the musician and public figure that she is now. It follows her journey in the creative world, in the arts, experimenting with different art forms. She spent a lot of her time when she was younger performing in street art and kind of busking and performing as a living statue. And it's all about her journey to becoming a creative person and finding who she is as a creative person. But it is also advice. Like, it is a book full of advice. It is a book of encouragement. It is a book that encourages you to pursue your dreams, to go for what you want, and most importantly to ask for help from others, to not feel like your creative endeavours have to be a solo pursuit that is quite isolating, but instead to ask for help when you need it, and to take advantage of help that people are offering you. And I think if you're feeling a little bit low or uninspired or need a little bit of a push to really embrace the things that you love in your life, whether they are creative arts like music or not, this book will do that for you, and it's just a wonderful, wonderful reading or listening experience, and of course incredibly accessible. The second non-fiction book that I would really recommend to listen to on audiobook is The Gender Games by Juno Dawson. So this one again is partially memoir. It follows Juno Dawson's journey as a trans woman coming out and transitioning, and her experiences throughout her life at the different stages on this journey. But it's also a sort of introduction to gender, to trans-inclusive feminism, to trans issues, and it's wonderfully, wonderfully done. Those might sound like quite dense topics, they might sound like quite daunting topics, but Juno's book is just incredibly clear and engaging, and I think that element of memoir, that element of autobiography that you get by hearing her story and her discussing these heavier issues within the context of her life makes it that much more accessible. And listening to the audiobook, which is narrated by Juno Dawson, I think makes it a little bit more like a conversation. It's like listening to somebody talk to you as opposed to reading a dense academic text, and I just think it's a really accessible book into to this topic, and a really important book. So regardless of whether you are deep into non-fiction or not, I think this is definitely one for everybody. But I did say I wanted to cover a broad range of books in this video, so the next book I want to recommend is actually a history book or a historical receptions book. It's about a lot of things, and that is Confronting the Classics by Mary Beard. Now, I hope with all of these books that they are books you can come to without any prior knowledge of the subject within their pages, and I hope that's true of Confronting the Classics, but I have to confess I read it when I already had a classics degree, so it's always a little bit difficult for me to judge. But I would say out of all of the ancient history books I've read, this is one of the most accessible. In this book, Mary Beard isn't just telling you the history of ancient Greece and ancient Rome, she's talking about why classics is relevant to today, she's talking about the study of classics, how that's developed over time, and giving you a really broad overview of the subject area in multiple different ways. And it felt very similar to some of my first year lectures at university, and I started my first year at university doing classics not having done classics before, so I think of that as being quite an accessible but in-depth level of historical study, and I definitely think this is a great piece of literature if you're at all interested in antiquity and classics, and I think a very accessible one at that. The next two books are actually really short little books, which also I think helps when it comes to the daunting task that is reading your first non-fiction books. And those are both of Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie's books. We have her first one, We Should All Be Feminists, and then a book that came out a little bit later on a similar topic called Dear Ija Welly, or A Feminist Manifesto in 15 Suggestions. As you can tell from the titles of these, they are both on the topic of feminism, and they are very introductory. They may be too introductory for some of you, but because of how introductory they are incredibly accessible non-fiction. I don't think it matters what age you are, you can read these, and I also think even if you are already familiar with feminism, they just sort of reinforce those basic principles, and Dear Ija Welly is a slightly more built upon version of We Should All Be Feminists, so perhaps this one is more for those of you that think you might be past this. But something else you can look for in non-fiction is young adult non-fiction. This is a thing, and it's a thing I hope continues to grow, because I think marketing non-fiction books at younger audiences is so important. And when I was a kid, I felt like there was a lot of children's non-fiction, but I don't remember there being sort of non-fiction aimed at teenagers or young adults. And just because it's a piece of young adult non-fiction as well does not mean you can't read it as an adult. And one piece of young adult non-fiction I'd really like to recommend to you is This Book Is Gay by Juno Dawson. Again, Juno Dawson's books are accessible, what can I say? They're also great. This is her other non-fiction book, which is aimed at a slightly younger audience but can certainly be read by everybody, and it is all about sexuality in all of its many glorious forms and sex, and it is a no-holds-barred, non-patronising discussion of sex and sexuality in a really positive way. And I just think that we need more books like that. I wish this was mandatory reading for all teenagers. I think it would make a lot of young people feel incredibly comfortable and also knowledgeable, and the same goes for adults, because unfortunately we can quite often get beyond our teenage years and not really have had a good education and introduction to these subjects. Next up, however, to keep the random mishmash of things going, I want to recommend On Writing, a Memoir of the Craft by Stephen King. This is partially Stephen King's memoir of his journey as a writer, and partially a book on writing and how to be a writer, sort of how to live a writer's life, how to make writing a part of your life in a really positive way. And it shows Stephen King's writing journey and how he embraced writing and how writing was a part of his life and his journey, as opposed to him having taken like 2 years out of university while his parents paid for him to write a novel in Spain, which is fine, but it's not the reality for most people who want to be a writer. And Stephen King had all of the other elements of life going on whilst he was still pursuing his writing and enjoying honing his craft. And whilst you follow his life, you also pick up some really practical and important pieces of advice. So for anybody that's interested in writing, I would say this is an excellent book to pick up, and again, incredibly accessible. I just find this to be such a readable book, despite being on a topic that is meant to guide you through something. It reads wonderfully, and again, it feels like a conversation, and Stephen King doesn't try to make things more complicated than they need to be. So I would highly recommend this one. My next recommendation is I Am Malala, which is a memoir. Now this one's interesting because you can buy the regular adult version of this book, or there is a slightly abridged version of this book targeted at young adults. Whatever one you want to read is fine, because this is about you finding your feet in non-fiction and you developing a love of non-fiction. So don't let anybody tell you one is the wrong one to read. Whatever works for you. Now, this book, whichever version you read, I personally would say is very accessible. This tells of Malala's story as a Pakistani girl dealing with the Taliban in her country and the repression of women, and her desire to have access to education, and her father's fight for women to have access to education. She was eventually shot by the Taliban and survived, and is now continuing to spread this really important message, and this is just a wonderful, wonderful book. It is very emotional, yet incredibly readable. Because Malala was a young person when she was experiencing all of this, and when she was writing this book with the help of another, it feels like the story of a young girl. It doesn't feel like an adult has written this book, and I feel like that's the right way for it to feel. It feels so personal, it feels so real, and it just is so important, and I cannot express to you how readable this book is. It is so readable, yet so full of important content, and I think books can be like that, and I think it's really important that they are like that. I don't think you have to sacrifice quality for accessibility. I also want to recommend to you I Call Myself a Feminist. This is a essay anthology, so it's actually a collection of various different essays by various different voices. They're all also quite short essays, and I feel like they are perhaps best compared to blog posts. They read like substantial blog posts. That's what they read like, and I think because of that this is such an accessible book. Again, it's a very introductory book to the topic of feminism. It might be too introductory for some of you, others may still appreciate it even if you've read other feminist texts, but one of the main messages of this book is that each of the individuals is describing why they call themselves a feminist. So it's enforcing the importance of actually identifying as a feminist, and how identifying as a feminist is both acknowledging that you desire equality and an end to sexism, but also that that doesn't currently exist, and by calling yourself a feminist, you're saying, I want to do something to make this better. I want to be a part of something that is fighting to change this in society. And there are so many different people talking in this book from so many different backgrounds, and because of that you get a really nice mixture. I think it's a really encouraging, inspiring and powerful collection of essays, but really, really easy reading. But lastly, I want to give a little shout out to non-fiction graphic novels. Now, I think this is one of the best and most accessible ways to introduce yourself to non-fiction, especially if you like graphic novels. So I did a whole video on non-fiction graphic novels, which means I'm not going to rattle all of them off in this video. If you are interested in reading non-fiction graphic novels, if you think that might be a good route for you, then check out that video. There are multiple recommendations in it. One of my all-time favourite non-fiction graphic novels, however, is Persepolis by Marjane Satrapi, which is another memoir about Marjane Satrapi, who is an Iranian woman, and it's about her life growing up both in and outside of Iran. But those are my recommendations for easy and accessible non-fiction, yet all excellent books. Once again, you don't have to sacrifice quality for accessibility. Both are possible, and I think it's an impressive feat to write accessible non-fiction. So these authors have all done amazing things, and I would love to hear what your recommendations would be for easy, accessible non-fiction, and perhaps people in the comments can get some more recommendations for books on different topics that perhaps I haven't covered in this video, because I certainly can't cover everything. Where did you start your non-fiction journey? If you are in that process, what book got you into non-fiction, or what kind of books? Do let me know. But until next time guys, happy reading, good luck on your non-fiction journey, and I will see you all again soon. Bye!